So it is an interesting thing to note, isn't it, in the grander sweep of the story of the French Revolution, that sometimes people think, a mob rose up in Paris and perhaps marched on Versailles, and that was sort of it. The government fell. There weren't sort of the Royalists didn't put up a fight, but of course it was quite a bitter fight all over the place. And a lot of them fled into exile, as you mentioned, into sort of Piedmont and places, all sorts of places. And a lot of them, I think it often is the case, isn't it, with sort of reactionary politics, that isn't really the right term, but they become, I think what you're about to start explaining the story of sort of ultra-royalists, right? A faction of politics which is more royalists than the actual monarch themselves, in a way.
This comes back in a very big way in in the form of Louis XVIII, but we'll sort of get to that soon.
Sure.
The other funny thing is that, though, at various points, so the Royalist movement sort of goes in a lot of different directions this time, and I think it's part of this this sort of general tendency and this experience that sort of shapes the later Royalist disposition, because you do get schisms later on as to how it should be handled at a tactical or even a strategic level. How should you be trying to get behind the idea of royalism potentially in the face of the king? And I think this is a very informative experience. This sort of like earlier stage down in Piedmont.
It's interesting, isn't it? And I know that you mentioned Leon there. Just one thing I would say I've always find fairly interesting is that a lot of the revolutionaries, the revolutionary governments in Paris did have to send out sort of small armies to like butcher lots of royalists, lots of towns that were effectively declared themselves to be royalist. I think in Lyon, the revolutionaries had to kill lots and lots and lots of people in Lyon. Like herd them into barns and set the barns alight and all sorts of frightfulness like that. So it's not like the royalist feeling in France just sort of disappeared. It didn't, did it? Not at all.
No, I mean, you can go as far as to say that it was the dominating feeling for, practically the entire period up to, I mean, you could potentially go as far as the 1870s or 80s, and that royalism is still the sort of dominant sentiment, but it just never quite has the same, they're basically a bunch of roadblocks in the way, or bumps in the road that end up derailing it to the extent that it can never reassert itself properly. But they face the problem early on, especially of organization, because what do you do if you're a revolutionary group that is not at all used to being a revolutionary group? You don't have any of the skills built up for doing things like evading, police, especially secret police, capture and disruption. You're used to being in charge, and you're used to trying to maintain authority and order rather than trying to, subvert it, essentially.
It's a good point. One last thing I'd just like to note on that. I think it's a very good point you've made, that it lasted past the 1848 great year of revolution, because Napoleon III was, voted president, but then sort of quite quickly just declared himself emperor. And, ruled for ages, like 17 odd years, something like that. So just the point is, again, a very broad point, I think, is that even though we've got this idea that the French are sort of staunch anti-monarchists, it died hard, didn't it? It died quite hard in the French heart. They were prepared to, they weren't prepared to give up their monarchy all that easily. I think that's an understatement.
Yeah, well, the third French Republic was actually founded, so after the Franco-Prussian War, it was founded by monarchists incredibly reluctly.
Right. Yeah, another great point. Sorry, I'll let you carry on with the days of, or the last days of Louis XVI.
Well, so this experience is quite... It's quite informative, I would say, to later history. And where I would pick this thread back up is over in 1807. So you have some figures like de Savigny serving alongside the émigrés and still sort of keeping up the banner, even though they've been, essentially chased across Europe at various points. So you get some of the, I believe it was the victory at Valmy, which sort of like crushed the original impetus to reimpose the monarchy by force. And that's when the revolutionary spirit kind of becomes a lot more martial, and it gets a fire lit under it, which keeps burning for quite a long time, and all across Europe, obviously. But figures like de Sauvigny, in particular, try to think about how they can better usurp, better basically do to the new revolutionary government by this point under Napoleon what the revolutionaries had done to them. And so one thing that it's treated as a bit ridiculous now, just sort of like an obsession that had no real basis in truth. But there was a wide scale, like a widespread belief among the émigrés that essentially it was all just down to Masons, and that there was just sort of like a cadre of groups like Freemasons and some others, possibly Jesuits. I can't remember whether they were supposed to have been involved or not. I don't think so, but yeah, the Masons were the big one, basically, and it was essentially just a conspiracy from inside, more or less.
What was the revolution or the Napoleonic era?
Well, yeah, I mean both right, in a way, but
it doesn't
primarily
make sense, like you say.
Yeah. And then essentially, from this conclusion, the Sauvigny and his brother, and I think a few others, basically set out to try to, accepting that as the case, how do we reverse the revolution? Well, we do it by recreating the Masons, but for our purposes. So what they do is that they, in the name of Christendom in particular, because this is after Napoleon is excommunicated, and a lot of the the Catholic and Royal Army is like the main Vendée army. So Catholicism is one of the main impetuses here, but alongside restoring things back to their sort of their proper place in 1789, they decide that they're going to form a Masonic type group with that express purpose in mind, basically, like an anti-Masonry.
Okay.
So what they do initially is they actually infiltrate the Masons itself. They figure out the structure. They work out how it all works at a sort of like institutional level, and then they straightforwardly just copy it. They just recreate their own group called the Chevalier de la Foi that I mentioned, the Knights of the Faith, and they use it as they use it as a vector, basically, to try to, for one thing, network up all of the different pro-royalist forces, especially in terms of the aristocrats. So they're trying to particularly select for people with some means and some influence, and then gather all those people together into a single organization that can be guided into in the direction of the restoration of the Bourbons. And this takes place over the course of I think it's supposed to have been officially founded in something like 1810, and then it continues through to 1826 essentially, but we'll sort of get back to that. But in its sort of like more revolutionary form, it obviously continues through to about 1815, 1816, when the Bourbon restoration starts in earnest.
Because one thing I wanted to ask there, you mentioned that sort of starting in about 1807 or 1810, something like that. In that period, that's when Napoleon arguably is sort of towards the very top of his career, sort of the great year of 1805, he's had that, but the disasters of Russia in 1812 hasn't happened, and Spain hasn't gone completely awry yet. Well, it's in about 1810, isn't it? It starts to go terribly wrong in Spain. So between 1807, 1810, I can only imagine this group and all the émigrés and the exiled Bourbons, they sort of must be at their, psychologically I suppose, at their lowest ebb. I mean, aren't a lot of them, isn't the later Louis XVIII and his brother, the Comte d'Artois, aren't they, a lot of them in America? Either way though, it just looks like that Bonaparte is riding high, is kind of invincible on some level. He's not going anywhere soon.
Yes, this actually influences their strategy quite significantly, because one other thing that's quite vital is that I believe by this point the uprisings on the Vendée have basically calmed down. They've been more or less subdued, and although that is not completely the case, there are still a lot of those sort of simmering resentments. the sort of worst of it when it was threatening to overtake whole regions of France is sort of somewhat past. And so anybody who is kind of looking at a potential Bourbon restoration has to take a different kind of vector. And so the way that they do this is through, again, basically just sort of networking everyone up, getting everyone communicating, getting everyone on the same page, organizing a structure of communication, organization, direction, quite importantly, and making sure that they have some kind of like coherent organization that they can govern somewhat nationwide. And that's basically what they focus on at the start. As you were saying, Napoleon is riding high for quite a long time, and what that means is that for its early stages, the knights basically just develop the organization and get everyone talking, and not really that much else. All they really want to do at that point is to try and build a kind of grassroots support to not only get everyone connected up, but also to try to proselytize royalism at a very low level. And that's one of the interesting things about the knights, actually, is that at the very lowest level, and this is much like how the Masons are supposed to operate, at the very lowest level, you would not actually know that you're involved in a revolutionary organization. You were basically just taking part in a Catholic charity group, which has some elements of nostalgia for the sort of like the Royalist era that's now past. But that's all it was. If you demonstrated either competence or interest, then you would be brought in gradually into higher and higher levels where you kind of get more of an understanding about what the group is actually doing. But it's not until you get into the potentially even the highest levels of leadership that you have any idea that the actual goal of the organization itself is the overthrow of the Napoleonic government and the revolutionary government, and to try to revert things back to 1789.
I feel like there's some parallels there in some perverse way with the Church of Scientology. But another thing, where you talked about where their first goal, or among their first goals, was just to get people talking, get lines of communications between people. Do you know what sprung to mind was the committees of correspondence in the American Revolution? That first and foremost, we just needed these disparate states, these disparate and often physically far-flung from each other groups of people, to sort of be on one page and to start communicating with each other. That's the first step.
It is, yeah, and it has a very powerful effect, actually, even if it's not immediately something which is going to be transferred into power. What it means is that it basically creates other opportunities down the line, and that's one of the things that they kind of struggle with in a sense, is because the turnaround for Napoleon happens so quickly that no one on the ground, in terms of the knights, among the ranks of the knights, are actually capable of responding to it in a timely enough fashion. So their persistent goal never really changes, like right up until the point at which Allied troops are marching into France. So they're still on the same page of just getting the word out and trying to get everyone networked in together. Again, primarily aristocrats, but bearing in mind there's a million or more aristocrats. So this isn't a small group by any stretch.
Yeah, when you say they're the turnaround for Napoleon, do you mean his downfall?
Yes,
right.
His initial, not the 100 days, but the reversal of fortunes of Napoleon is not something that the knights are ultimately prepared for.
Right.
So what it means is that they're not prepared to launch any kind of insurrection or uprising, because it had never been sort of built into their intended strategy at that stage. They were thinking maybe, as far as I can tell, they were thinking that maybe that would be a possibility somewhere down the line, but they did not think that they were anywhere near ready for that. Nor did they think that it would be something that they would be prepared for in a short time span. So basically, they're forced to accept the fact that France is going to be invaded by liberated by the Allied powers, and they are going to have a relatively minimal role in it. But they sort of scramble to do what they can. So in particular, whenever there are any armies that are coming and taking French towns, so in particular Bordeaux, taken by Wellington, the people that come out and meet the troops are essentially Knights of the Faith or mobs that have been organized by the Knights of the Faith, wearing uniform. Basically, they have white cockades, and they're all basically on the same page, and they're all chanting for the return of the Bourbons. And so in that sense, they can present the image of like a fait accompli, and they can actually negotiate. The local department leaders, the regional leaders of the Knights of the Faith, can be the ones who are actually negotiating with the allied armies and presenting themselves as the new governments of these various towns and cities.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.